High in the rugged mountains of Persia during the 11th century, a shadowy brotherhood struck fear into empires and kings, the assassins. Known as the Nizari Ismailis, they were not ordinary warriors, but masters of secrecy, strategy, and psychological warfare. From hidden fortresses like the legendary Alamut, they challenged both Crusaders and mighty caliphates, wielding daggers and ideas with equal power. Were they ruthless killers or defenders of a persecuted faith? Their legacy still sparks fascination and mystery today. Join us as we uncover the true story of the assassins, the feared and misunderstood order that shaped medieval history. Whispers of fear and faith. In the chronicles of medieval history, few names inspire as much intrigue as the assassins. Rising in the rugged mountains of Iran during the late 11th century, this mysterious brotherhood became synonymous with stealth, daggers, and sudden death. Their very name has passed into modern languages to mean killers who strike without warning. But behind the myths of black-cloaked fanatics and tales of intoxicated killers lies a more complex and fascinating reality. The assassins were not a random sect of murderers. They were the Nizari Ismailis, a branch of shrouded Islam that faced relentless persecution. Their story is one of survival against overwhelming odds, where faith, strategy, and reputation became weapons more powerful than armies. To understand them, we must explore the religious, political, and cultural currents of the 10th and 11th centuries in Iran. The turbulent world of 10th to 11th century Iran. Iran in the 10th and 11th centuries was a land of shifting powers and clashing faiths. The mighty Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was losing direct control over its vast domains. Regional dynasties, such as the Buyids and later the Seljuk Turks, rose to prominence, often overshadowing the caliph himself. Amid this political instability, deep religious divides intensified. Islam was not a monolithic faith. The dominant Sunni interpretation, supported by most rulers, often came into conflict with Shia communities, who believed the leadership of the Muslim world rightfully belonged to the descendants of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. Within Shi'ism itself, there were divisions, and one of the most significant was the split between the Ismailis and the Twelvers. The Ismailis were a dynamic, intellectually vibrant community. They emphasized esoteric interpretations of Scripture and loyalty to a living imam. But this distinct vision often brought them into conflict with Sunni rulers, who saw them as dangerous heretics. By the 11th century, Ismailis across Iran were vulnerable, persecuted, and hunted. It was in this climate that the assassins emerged. The birth of a brotherhood, Hassan-i Sabah. The legendary figure behind the rise of the assassins was Hassan-i Sabah. Born around 1050 in Qom, Iran, Hassan grew up in a Shia environment, but eventually embraced the Ismaili cause after traveling to Cairo, the heart of the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimids, an Ismaili dynasty, ruled Egypt and parts of North Africa, and were rivals to both the Sunni Abbasids and the Seljuk Turks. Hassan proved to be a brilliant thinker, organizer, and strategist. But his ambitions soon brought him back to Persia, where he sought to establish a stronghold for the Ismaili cause. Around 1090, he captured a mountain fortress in northern Iran called Alamut, perched high in the Alborz Mountains. From Alamut, Hassan and his followers carved out an independent community, protected by the mountains and sustained by local support. Yet they were surrounded by enemies: the Seljuk Turks to the east and west, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and hostile neighbors suspicious of their beliefs. Lacking armies and resources to fight conventional wars, Hassan developed a new strategy: targeted political assassinations. The assassin method: daggers, fear, and precision. The word assassin itself comes from hostile sources. Medieval Crusaders and Muslim chroniclers often referred to the Nizari Ismailis as ashen, a derogatory term meaning hashish users. Over time, this insult morphed into the Western word assassin. Though legends spread of drug devotees sent on suicide missions, historians find little evidence for such tales. Instead, the assassins relied on discipline, secrecy, and psychological warfare. Their method was precise. Carefully selected targets. Rather than engage in mass killings, the assassins focused on individuals, political leaders, military commanders, and influential clerics who threatened their community. Close-range attacks. Assassinations were carried out publicly, often with daggers, to send a clear political message. Poison or arrows were avoided, as these could seem cowardly or indiscriminate. Psychological shock. The goal was not only to eliminate enemies, but to instill fear. Leaders across the Middle East learned that opposing the assassins could mean death at any time, even in the heart of a guarded court. Sacrifice and loyalty. The operatives, known as fidouis, devotees, were willing to sacrifice their lives. Some died during missions, others were executed after capture, but their loyalty was legendary. Through these methods, the assassins turned weakness into strength. They did not need vast armies. Their enemies began to see daggers in the shadows everywhere. Alamut, fortress of faith. Alamut, the stronghold of the assassins, became more than a military base. It was a center of learning, governance, and spirituality. Hassan I-Sabbah transformed it into a self-sustaining society, complete with schools, libraries, and agricultural innovations, such as terrace farming. Contrary to lurid myths of gardens filled with drugs and seduction, stories spread by their enemies, Alamut appears to have been a disciplined, almost austere community. Hassan himself was said to be strict, banning indulgence, and insisting on study and devotion. For the Ismailis, Alamut was both a refuge and a symbol. From here, they resisted mighty empires for nearly 2 centuries. Enemies and operations. The assassins' most frequent enemies were the Seljuk Turks, who saw them as a dangerous, heretical sect. One of their first major assassinations was that of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuks, in 1092. His death shocked the Muslim world and announced the arrival of the assassins as a force to be reckoned with. They also targeted Crusader leaders. Though often painted as anti-Christian zealots, the assassins were pragmatic. Sometimes they struck against Crusader barons. Other times they allied with them when it suited their survival. Chroniclers even record an alleged attempt on the life of Saladin, the great Muslim leader, though accounts differ on whether the attack was genuine or exaggerated. The assassins were equal opportunity opponents, striking against both Sunni and Crusader leaders whenever their community was threatened. Myth and legend. Gardens of Paradise. Over time, the assassins became the subject of wild legends, particularly among Crusaders who encountered them in the Levant. The most famous myth was that of the secret Garden of Paradise. According to these tales, young recruits were drugged with hashish, taken into lush gardens filled with wine and maidens, and told they had tasted heaven. Upon awakening, they were promised eternal bliss if they obeyed the Imam's commands, even to the point of death. This story, popularized by Marco Polo in the 13th century, captivated Europe and cemented the association of assassins with drugs and fanaticism. Modern historians, however, doubt its truth. More likely, it was propaganda spread by their enemies to portray them as dangerous heretics enslaved by deception. Yet the myth endures, shaping the popular imagination down to the present day. Faith and philosophy. Though feared for their assassinations, the Nizari Ismailis were not merely killers. They were also a community with a rich intellectual tradition. Ismaili scholars contributed to philosophy, theology, and the sciences, often preserving knowledge during turbulent times. Central to their faith was loyalty to the Imam, whom they saw as the rightful guide of the Muslim community. They believed the Imam possessed divine knowledge that revealed deeper, esoteric truths of the Quran. This devotion gave their movement cohesion, even under constant threat. In this sense, the assassins were not only fighters, but also guardians of a spiritual vision that transcended their political struggles. Decline and legacy. The power of the assassins in Iran and Syria lasted for nearly 2 centuries. But by the mid-13th century, their world was collapsing. The rise of the Mongols brought a level of destruction no fortress could withstand. In 1256, Hulagu Khan's armies besieged Alamut. Despite fierce resistance, the fortress fell, its libraries burned, and its communities scattered. Though crushed militarily, the Nizari Ismailis did not vanish. They survived in hidden communities, eventually re-emerging centuries later in South Asia under new leaders, the Aga Khans. Today, the Ismailis are a respected Muslim community, far removed from the bloody legends of their past. Yet the word assassin remains a testament to the fear they once inspired. Explaining the legacy. The assassins of 10th to 11th century Iran occupy a unique place in history. They were survivors, a persecuted minority who found ingenious ways to endure. Strategists, masters of psychological warfare, turning their small numbers into a powerful reputation. Mythmakers. Their enemies' propaganda helped transform them into legends that live on centuries later. Scholars, keepers of esoteric philosophy and contributors to Islamic thought, far more complex than the caricature of killers. Their story reveals how marginalized groups navigate hostile worlds, sometimes through unconventional, even shocking methods. It also reminds us how history is shaped as much by myth as by fact. The fear that spread without armies. In the mountains of Iran during the 11th century, whispers began to circulate in palaces, marketplaces, and military camps. A rumor of a sect so disciplined, so shadowy, and so terrifying that even the mightiest rulers slept uneasily. They were called many names by their enemies, heretics, fanatics, Hashishin, but the world would come to remember them simply as the assassins. To their foes, they were ruthless killers who struck without warning, daggers flashing in crowded courts or sacred mosques. To their followers, they were loyal defenders of a persecuted faith, willing to give their lives for survival and for the protection of their Imam. To history, they left a paradoxical legacy. Both feared for their violence and admired for their discipline and strategy. This is the story of how a small community, hemmed in by enemies, carved out a reputation that shook empires. A story of daggers in the shadows. The world of the assassins. Iran in the 11th century. The 11th century was a time of turbulence across the Middle East. The once powerful Abbasid Caliphate had become largely symbolic, overshadowed by strong regional dynasties. Chief among these were the Seljuk Turks, who stormed into Iran and Iraq, becoming the de facto rulers of much of the Muslim world. While Sunnis dominated politically and militarily, Shura communities lived under constant suspicion. Within Shurism itself, the Ismailis represented a particularly radical branch. Unlike the more widespread Twelver Shura, the Ismailis believed in a living, present Imam descended from Ali. Their loyalty to the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo, an Ismaili dynasty rival to the Sunni Abbasids, made them targets of persecution. For the Ismailis in Persia, the threat was existential. They were hunted, scattered, and accused of heresy. Yet out of this climate of danger arose a figure who would transform their fate. Hassan I Sabah. Hassan-I Sabbah, the visionary of Alamut. Born in Qom around 1050, Hassan-I Sabbah was raised in a Shura environment, but eventually converted to Ismailism after encountering its missionaries. His journey led him to Cairo, where he encountered the intellectual and spiritual depth of the Fatimid Ismaili tradition. But Hassan was not destined to remain in Egypt. His destiny lay in Iran. Returning to Persia, he became a tireless organizer, spreading the Ismaili message among disillusioned communities. In 1090, through careful planning and covert alliances, Hassan seized the mountain fortress of Alamut in the Alborz Mountains. Perched high above the valleys, Alamut became the nerve center of the assassins. From here, Hassan built not only a stronghold, but an entire society, sustained by agriculture, scholarship, and faith. Surrounded by enemies, he realized his people could not survive by conventional warfare. Instead, he devised a strategy that turned their weakness into strength: targeted assassination, a new kind of warfare. The assassin's method was revolutionary. While great empires relied on armies, Hassan relied on a few devoted followers, the fidayas or devotees. These young men were trained in stealth, patience, and loyalty. They did not seek indiscriminate slaughter. Instead, they struck surgically, eliminating key leaders who threatened their community. The method: targets chosen with care. Assassinations were reserved for viziers, generals, and rulers whose deaths would destabilize enemies. Dagger over poison. The dagger was their weapon of choice, personal, direct, and public. A ruler killed in front of his court inspired far more terror than one who mysteriously sickened. Public impact. These attacks were often staged in full view, ensuring that witnesses carried the story far and wide. Sacrifice. Many fighters did not expect to survive their missions. Their willingness to die reinforced the aura of invincibility around the sect. In 1092, one of their first major strikes shocked the Muslim world. Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuks, was stabbed to death by a disguised assassin. His fall destabilized the Seljuk state and announced to the world that a new, unseen power had risen. The fortress of Alamut, reality and myth. Alamut was more than a military base. It was a laboratory of survival. Hassan-I Sabbah turned it into a place of discipline and learning, with a library, schools, and even sophisticated irrigation systems. Ismaili philosophy flourished within its walls, exploring the hidden meanings of the Quran and cultivating resilience in the face of adversity. But legends soon grew around Alamut. Crusaders and Sunni chroniclers, hostile to the sect, spread lurid tales of gardens filled with pleasures, where young men were drugged with hashish and led to believe they had tasted paradise. Awakened, they were told that obedience to their master would return them to that bliss. This story, carried into Europe by travelers like Marco Polo, gave rise to the term assassin and fixed the image of drugged fanatics in Western imagination. Yet modern historians argue that such accounts were propaganda. Hassan's community was austere, not indulgent. Their true strength lay in faith, discipline, and strategy, not intoxication. Daggers against empires. The assassins did not wage indiscriminate terror. Their actions were focused, calculated, and meant to level the playing field against overwhelming enemies. Against the Seljuks, determined to crush the Ismailis, became their primary foes. Viziers, generals, and governors who directed campaigns against Alamut often found themselves facing the assassin's blade. Against Crusaders. In the Levant, the assassins also operated, sometimes striking against Crusader barons. But they were pragmatic. At times they allied with Crusaders against mutual enemies, proving they were not bound by blind ideology, but by survival. Saladin himself. Chronicles tell of an attempted assassination against Saladin, the great Muslim general. Though he survived, the attempt reinforced the sense that no leader, no matter how mighty, was safe from the shadows. This unpredictability became their greatest weapon. Rulers had to consider not just armies and fortresses, but the possibility that a dagger might strike them in their own court. Fear itself became a form of power, faith as a fortress. While their daggers made them infamous, the assassins' identity was rooted in faith. They were Ismailis first and foremost, bound by loyalty to the living Imam, whom they believed was divinely guided. Their esoteric theology emphasized hidden truths beneath the literal words of Scripture. This spiritual dimension is often overlooked. To the assassins, their struggle was not one of banditry, but of survival and devotion. They saw themselves as defenders of truth in a hostile world. Their willingness to die was not born of intoxication, but of conviction that martyrdom brought them closer to the divine. Decline in the face of the Mongols. For nearly 2 centuries, the assassins endured. But in the 13th century, a new power rose that no fortress could withstand: the Mongols. In 1256, Hulagu Khan, brother of the Great Khan, led an army into Persia. Determined to eliminate any threat to Mongol dominance, he targeted Alamut. Despite its near-legendary defenses, the fortress fell after a prolonged siege. The library was burned, and the assassins' power in Iran was broken. In Syria, they lasted a bit longer, but by the end of the 13th century, their influence had waned. The era of daggers in the shadows was over. Survival beyond destruction. Though the Mongols shattered their military might, the Nizari Ismailis did not vanish. Scattered and persecuted, they went underground, preserving their traditions in secret. Over centuries, they re-emerged in new lands, particularly in South Asia, under leaders known as the Aga Khans. Today, the Ismailis are a global community, recognized for their emphasis on education, charity, and cultural engagement, a far cry from the feared reputation of their assassin ancestors. Yet the memory of the assassins remains, a testament to how myth can outlast even empires. Explaining the legacy. The assassins occupy a unique and complex place in history. As survivors, they exemplify how marginalized groups can find unconventional strategies to endure against overwhelming odds. As strategists, they demonstrated that power can come not just from armies, but from precision, fear, and reputation. As myths, much of what we know is shaped by hostile chroniclers and fascinated outsiders. Their true story lies somewhere between austere discipline and exotic legend. As symbols, to some, they remain symbols of resistance, to others, of fanaticism. Their legacy resists simplification. Daggers in the shadows. The story of the assassins is a reminder that history is often written not only by victors, but also by those who strike from the margins. In the mountains of Iran, a small community carved out a space for survival, wielding faith and strategy as their twin weapons. Their daggers silenced viziers, unsettled kings, and forced empires to reckon with an enemy they could never fully control. To some, they were ruthless fanatics, proof of heresy and danger. To others, they were brave defenders of identity, willing to sacrifice everything for their cause. Both perspectives carry truth, for the assassins were both killers and believers, both feared enemies and misunderstood survivors. Though their fortresses fell and their power dissolved under the Mongols, their legend endures. The very word assassin, born of propaganda and myth, lives on in our languages. Their story echoes in novels, films, and games, proof that daggers in the shadows can leave marks deeper than the sword. The assassins of 11th century Iran remind us that history is not only about empires and armies, but about those who dwell in the margins, shaping the world through fear, faith, and reputation. Their mark cannot be erased, for in every whispered tale of unseen killers, in every retelling of their legend, the assassins live on. The assassins of 11th century Iran remain one of history's most enigmatic brotherhoods, both feared and misunderstood. From their mountain strongholds, they defied empires, altered the course of wars, and carved a legend that still echoes in stories today. Were they villains, visionaries, or simply survivors in a hostile world? Their legacy reminds us that power is not always measured by armies, but by strategy, belief, and reputation. If you enjoyed this journey into their hidden world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold histories. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows of the past.